Hi, I'm Brian from Reload, Orange County Reloading Supply in Anaheim. Want to take a little bit of time here and talk to you about crimping. Crimping is something that we do to keep the projectile that is seated into the casing exactly where we put it. We're going to put a little bit more bite on that bullet so it doesn't move. So if, for example, let's say we're going to be loading ammunition for a lever action rifle. When you shoot, bang, the gun goes rearward, and then you've got a spring inside that tube magazine. The spring is going to take up some of the slack. Now the cartridge that is waiting to be fed up is going to get hit by all of the weight of the ammunition in the tube ahead of it. So those cartridges start to travel rearward, tick, 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 bam, it smacks into the cartridge, the nose of the bullet that's waiting to be fed up, and at that point it can get shoved deeper into the casing. If you are shooting a revolver, one of those lightweight things by Smith, or there's others that do them, where you've got scandium, titanium, polymer frame guns, if you do not have a sufficient bite on that, basically your revolver is turned into a kinetic bullet puller. So you have kind of the opposite problem. Instead of the projectile being shoved deeper into the casing, throwing your pressures way through the roof, the bullet can come out. And in the case of a revolver, the projectile is protruding through the cylinder. You go to pull the trigger, the gun's going to cycle the cylinder, rotating it upwards, or maybe you go to cock the gun manually in a single action, and the projectile is now going to hit the side of the barrel. And it can't go any further because the bullet's hitting the side of the barrel. And you can't turn it back the other way because it doesn't go the other way. So now you got a problem. Hopefully you seated your primers well below flush, because if you've got a high primer at that point, the recoil shield on a revolver gets closer to the barrel as that cylinder turns, the projectile going to be coming into alignment with the barrel. It's getting closer in space. So when the casing fires, although headspace is off of the rim, which stops its forward movement, it can't go much further backwards. So if you've got to tap that projectile a little bit deeper into the casing to get it out of there, or to fire it or whatever, hopefully you don't have that thing with a high primer to where you can actually make it go bang, because it's going to be in a cylinder contained in a chamber, and it's going to do what it's supposed to do. And you can always disassemble the gun, take the crane apart, whatever you're going to do to safely deal with that. But if you put a nice bite on that projectile to begin with, you won't have the problem to deal with. And that's kind of the idea here. Same thing with a lot of semi-automatics. When they feed up at a little bit of an angle. And the nose of the projectile can hit the top of the chamber, and the bottom of the casing is hitting kind of down there on the ramp, and then the bolt face is going to push that into the chamber. Well, at this point, the projectile can get shoved deeper into the casing. So again, we can have a pressure spike. So if we just put a reasonable bite, depending upon the caliber and the gun that it's going in, we can avoid all of these problems. And a lot of times we can improve performance at the same time as well, because you're providing a slight delay for the pressure to build, for the powder to burn more completely, in order to get that bullet started down the barrel. So if we are loading, like say for example in a revolver or even a lever action, if you've got a projectile that's got a crimp groove, okay, so on bullets, you have here, you got the grease groove, which is going to provide lubricant, and then this groove right here, that's a crimp groove. So in this instance, when we're loading for this projectile, we would want to do a roll crimp, where we're actually going to take the case mouth and we're going to roll it, fold it into that groove. If we have a projectile that has a cannelure, that's the serrations that are all the way around here, that you could, depending upon, again, the cartridge, whether it headspace is off of the mouth or whether it headspace is off of the rim, either do a roll or a taper crimp. Again, the idea here is that we're providing more bite on the projectile so it will stay right where we put it. Now, a lot of times when you buy a die set, real common, you got yourself a 9mm and you bought some RCBS carbide dies, and you notice that on the label it says TC. You know, that's a taper crimp seater. So you can do two functions in one. So you resize and you decap, you put in a new primer, you're going to flare the mouth, throw in a powder charge, and you go to seat the bullet. You can seat and crimp in the same operation. That can be real problematic. First of all, you want to have your casings all within 3 thousandths of each other if you're going to be doing that. preferably all dead nuts right on. But the more outside of 3000s, and in particular probably closer to 5000s, you're going to start to introduce more and more problems, because when you go to flare the mouth of the casing, a taller case will have a wider flare, a shorter case will have a smaller flare, and then when you go to crimp, a taller case will have a heavier crimp, and a shorter case will have a lighter crimp, because that's a function of how high up it either goes onto the expander mandrel or into the crimp die itself to provide that bite. So if you want to take the time to trim your casings on your 9s, 40, 45 ACP and all those that headspace off of the mouth of the casing, great. Hardly anybody I know actually does that, because you can get away with not trimming your casings on those straight wall casings. Now, just because you can get away with something doesn't mean you should do it, or in this case not do it, not trim your casings. You're better off if you are. It's just a little bit time consuming. So if you take the time to do that, okay, and then if you're going to crimp and seat in the same operation, life is going to be a whole lot better if you're using a projectile that's got a crimp groove, because the crimping function is going to take place just prior to the bullet getting pushed to its correct overall length. So what's happening is the crimp is starting to bite the projectile while the stem is still trying to shove it deeper into the case. Well, you've got the thing sized and you flared, and now you're putting excess pressure on the case mouth, and what's going to happen is it's either going to bow at the bottom, you can crush the casing, you can, something like that. And I get people in here all the time who are just having nothing but a miserable time trying to crimp and seat in the same operation. So I tell them, don't do that. Crimp in a separate operation. Seat in one operation, back the stem way up or just take it out of the die, and then go back and crimp as a final step with those straight wall casings. Now, when you're, again, if you don't understand headspace, we're talking about what stops its forward movement going into the chamber, and the bolt that stops its rearward movement when the gun fires. So 9mm, for example, it headspaces off of the mouth. Any of these casings that headspace off of the mouth, you always want to use a taper crimp. See, what it's going to do is it's going to take the case mouth and kind of fold it in a little bit against the projectile. If you use what is called a roll crimp on something that headspaces off of the mouth, what you're doing is you're taking the length of this thing, the casing that stops its forward movement into the chamber, and you roll it in. Now you just made that case a lot shorter. Now it's going to go further in, and when it fires, it can go a lot further rearward. So you've got a whole bunch of airspace in that chamber to the bolt face that we do not want to have. Now, if, for example, you're loading for a revolver, that head spaces off of the rim of the casing. The rim stops its forward movement going into the cylinder. You can do a roll, you can do a taper. You may find you get better performance out of one than the other. And fine, play with all of that. But the whole idea behind crimping is to keep the projectile right where we put it. And too often I'm hearing stuff about, well, what is that doing to my accuracy? Look, this is a separate issue. If you want to talk about accuracy, we'll have a completely different discussion about it. But crimping is more about safety than it is about accuracy. Yes, it will affect in one way or another accuracy. In some ways it can improve it, in other ways it may be detrimental. But the bottom line here is, if you get into the habit of doing at least a light crimp on stuff, safety-wise, you're just going to be better off.